This week, we are starting with women in the life of Boris Pasternak. This is important to sort of think about the different women in his life because they're reflected in the book. And as we go through, some of them characters or combinations of his wives or people he was interested in, had, brief relationships with. But it also shows a lot of how he is the character Yuri, living a life that's involved in poetry, which you'll hear from some of the things as a result of the various women in his life. So it's sort of important to know about the women in his life as you read the book. So first woman in his life, Olga Friedenberg. Now, this is very strange because he and Olga were cousins and they grew up together in the same nursery, a little bit like Tanya in the book, who he knew from when she was very little. And they shared the same nursery, but were separated when the Friedenberg family moved to St. Petersburg. And then in 1910, when they were 20, they met again and fell in love, but they were never lovers. The cousins' initial passion developed into a lifelong close friendship. From 1910, Pasternak and Friedenberg exchanged frequent letters, and their correspondence lasted over 40 years until 1954. They last actually met in person in 1936. And here's a quote from Pasternak talking about Olga, so you can see his poetic tendencies early on. "You do not know how my tormenting feeling grew and grew until it became obvious to me and others. As you walked beside me with complete detachment, I could not express it to you. It was a rare sort of closeness, as if we two, you and I, were in love with something that was utterly indifferent to both of us, something that remained aloof from us by the virtue of its extraordinary inability to adapt to the other side of life." So that was what he had written in one of his letters to Olga, who was his very first love, that started from when he was young, similar to Tanya, who, of course, he knew as a child and eventually marries in the book, of course. All right. Next one is Ida Wysotsky. Now, below here, you see she was born in 1892. She's just 2 years younger than Boris Pasternak. And you see the various spellings here of Wysotsky, Vyotska, Davidova. When I was researching her, it was amazing, all the different spellings and references to the same person, Ida. And those were some of the different spellings, which is what I find confusing about Russian because everybody's spelling things differently. She was the daughter of a wealthy Jewish family who owned the world's largest tea company based in Moscow. This tea company exists today. If you Google Wysotsky Tea Company, you can learn about their 500 flavors of tea. They met in 1912 when Boris's father painted her portrait with her sister. And that's over here on this side. This is her, the younger one with the dark hair. But that's his father's portrait. So you can see his father was quite the artist. It's a lovely portrait of them. And so his father was painting her portrait, and then Boris was tutoring her during her last year of high school. And he was very much in love with her, and he proposed marriage to her. But her family said, you know what, poor prospects here for you, and no, you can't marry him. And so she turned him down. And he wrote this poem called Marburg. And this is just the first stanza. And I do have later, if we have time or want to go back to it. It's such a sad poem, but here's the start of it. Marburg was where they met, which is why it's called Marburg. And he wrote this after she dumped him. "I quivered, I flared up, and then was extinguished. I shook. I had made a proposal, but late, too late. I was scared, and she had refused me. I pity her tears, and more blessed than a saint." And this goes on for about 10 stanzas of sadness by poor Boris. He could really write a tale about this, but we can come back to more later. But this was, as you can see, he wrote after Olga. He writes again after Ida, leaves him and tells him, to move on. So he finally meets Evgenia Luria Pasternak, who is younger than him again. You can see she's 1898 and he was 1890. And here's a picture of them together with their son, Evgeny, who is his oldest boy. She was a painter and student at the Art Institute. When they met, they were married in 1922 and then divorced in 1931. I could not find much about their relationship, what it was like. I mean, I know how it broke up because we'll get to his next wife, but during this time period, this is when he was doing a lot of poetry from 1922 till about 1930. He was publishing his books of poetry and writing poetry all the time. And of course, having his first son. So next up was Zenaida, I hope I'm saying this, Zenaida Newhouse Pasternak, also younger than him, you could say 1897. They met in 1932 when they were both married. And she was married to the Russian pianist Heinrich Newhouse. They both divorced their spouses and then married in 1934 and remained married until his death in 1960. She was infuriated. The next person we'll talk about was a different Olga from Olga Friedenberg, but Olga Ivanskaya, who he had a long-time affair with. She was infuriated by that affair, and at one time confronted her. And so here's a little story with that before he went. Once when his younger son was Leonid, his son he had with Zenaida, was ill, Zenaida exacted a promise from her husband as they stood by the boy's sickbed that he would have end his affair with Ivanskaya. Pasternak asked Luisa Popova, a mutual friend, to tell Ivanskaya about his promise to give her up. Popova told him, "You got to do it yourself." Okay. And so soon after, Ivanskaya happened to be ill at Popova's apartment when suddenly Zenaida Pasternak arrives in her apartment and confronts her.
Wow.
And then this is Ivanskaya recalling the confrontation. She said, "Because I became so ill through a loss of blood that she and Louisa had to get me to the hospital, I no longer remember exactly what passed between me and this heavily built, strong-minded woman who kept repeating how she didn't give a damn for our love, and that although she no longer loved Boris Leonidovich herself, she would not allow her family to be broken up. After my return from the hospital, Boris came to visit me as though nothing happened and touchingly made his peace with my mother, telling her how much he loved me. By now, she was pretty well used to these funny ways of his." And that was from her talk about it. So Zenaida was apparently brusque, pretty authoritarian, had a son, Leonid, with him, and she was not leaving with him. She stayed with him all the way through while he was also with Olga. So going to be a little bit similar to how things will progress eventually in Dr. Zhivago as well. Now, Olga Ivanskaya, 1912. First of all, she was 34 and he was 56 when they met. And Olga was married twice. She got married in 1936 and her husband hanged himself in 1939. So that did not go well. Her second husband, who she married in 1941, he got killed in the World War, died in World War II. She had one child with each of them. She had a girl with her first husband and a boy with the second husband. She met Pasternak in 1946 when she was in charge at the New Authors at Novy Mir, which was a periodical being produced in Russia. She came home from that meeting and told her mother, "I have just been talking to God." So she was pretty smitten with Pasternak. She, of course, is considered the inspiration for Laura in the novel, although a lot of people will say it is a combination of Laura and Zenaida. Nobody seems to think Evgeny had anything to do with the character in that. They worked to keep their affair secret. Pasternak would phone her neighbor, who would bang on her pipes to let her know he was calling. So they wouldn't know. Felt like it was Tony Orlando and Dawn, like knock 3 times on the ceiling. He was having her knock on the pipes to let them know she was coming. She was at Pasternak's side. I don't know. My next one. There's a picture of the two of them together. She was at Pasternak's side during the well-orchestrated storm of attacks from Soviet authorities and the general public following the publication of Dr. Zhivago Abroad. The novel was deemed anti-Soviet, and there were demands for Pasternak's expulsion or arrest. She said, a quote from Olga, she said, "Never before between us was there such unanimity of the hearts. It was like in the novel." There's that quote on there from her, but that she felt they were spirits together. The Soviets, trying to pressure Pasternak into abandoning his criticism of the regime, arrested Ivanskaya in 1949. She was sentenced to 4 years of hard labor. She was pregnant with Pasternak's baby when she was arrested and imprisoned in Lubyanka prison. She was promised a visit from Pasternak and was instead led through the prison corridors to a morgue. Fearing that Pasternak's body lay among the cadavers, she collapsed and suffered a miscarriage. So the Russian authorities were, really messing with her while she was in there. She suffered quite a bit of torture. In 1953, she was released from prison and said wild happiness and finally total calm, saying she and Pasternak had decided to live together in any form that life took. And that's how she was going to try to go on with this. So they continue to see each other all the time. And he's an inspiration. They live together off and on, but he's still with his wife as well. However, poor Olga once again gets arrested once he passes away. She was arrested on trumped up charges of currency speculation and sentenced in November of 1960 to 8 years in a Siberian labor camp. When they came for her, they also arrested her daughter. They were both treated harshly while they were there. Her daughter served 2 years, and she was quietly released in 1964, not serving the whole sentence. They sort of let her slip out of there. So in a quote there, as you can see from Pasternak, said, and of course he didn't live obviously to see her second arrest, but she was put in jail on my account as the person considered by the secret police to be closest to me, and they hoped by means of a grueling interrogation and threats they could extract enough evidence from her to put me on trial. I owe my life and the fact that they did not touch me in those years to her heroism and endurance. So one of the questions was, did Olga Ivanskaya betray Pasternak and turn him in? And there's lots of controversy about this. So Ivanskaya told the Soviet leader Khrushchev at the time how she tried to cancel the writers' meetings with foreigners, worked closely with the Central Committee to try to delay publication in the West of Dr. Zhivago, and dissuaded Pasternak from leaving the Soviet Union after he was forced to turn down the Nobel Prize he won in 1958. The letter that was released from the archives that once belonged to the Central Communist Party's Central Committee was published in extracts by a Moscow newspaper early this month, but not earlier this month. This is back in the 60s. And the quote that was in there from her was, "I did everything in my power to avoid a misfortune, but it was beyond my capacity to neutralize everything at once," she wrote on March 10th, 1961. "I would like to make it clear that it was Pasternak himself who wrote the novel. One should not portray him as an innocent lamb." Now, she wrote this while she was imprisoned. And a lot of people felt that, and there was a lot of talk about her betraying him, offering, trying to prevent the publication of the book, working with the Soviets to stop him from doing things. He did not believe any of that at the time from her first imprisonment, and a lot of people from the second. Most Russians are all too aware of the compromises and betrayal millions of people were forced to commit to protect themselves and their families from the KGB. Few have a clear conscience, many, including Pasternak's elder son, who described the article as insulting and disgusting, were appalled that a newspaper had sensationalized a woman's desperate last-ditch effort to save herself. But a few were delighted by its revelations. So this was kind of a thing like that stirred up a lot of, and it was printed in a lot of papers. I read articles from the Tampa Bay papers, from the Chicago papers. I mean, lots of people saying she had done this, but I think what really turned out was that Olga Ivanskaya was trying to get out of prison when she was set into hard labor again for 8 years, and said some things, but, she did not portray, she felt like that it was all made up, that she didn't portray him at the time, and that a lot of this was made up. So she was definitely the inspiration for Laura in the book. This is our questions for the next thing, but for our discussion. Do we want to look at those questions first, Peter, or do you want to come back and?
Well, have you folks looked at the questions? Yes. Okay. So I don't really think there's a need to read them out. I think.
Okay, great. I will stop the share in case we need to go back to them. They're on there. And as I say, if we need to go back, we can look at that poem Marburg too, if we have time at the end, because that was pretty amazing.
Okay.
So as you can see, Boris Pasternak had a group of women in his life that influenced his poetry and his writing and were tied into the themes of the book. And I think Olga Ivanskaya could have she did write a book herself later in life that you can read about her. But, what an incredible life. I mean, to have your first husband hanged himself, second husband killed in World War II, third husband gets you jailed twice in labor camps, and you hang right in there with him till the day he dies. She's a pretty amazing person and, was obviously a source of inspiration for him. But also Zenaida was pretty amazing too, that she was going to stick with this whole thing. So a lot going on in Boris's life while he's writing Dr. Zhivago. Okay.
What do we know about his life experiences during the period we were just talking about or studying during the revolution and early war years? What did he experience?
Yes. Absolutely.
No, what? What was his life like?
Well, he started out being a very well-recognized poet who was being praised by everybody. And then when the revolution started and he wasn't towing the line as to what he was writing, he couldn't get any work at all. So he ended up translating books for a living. And then once Dr. Zhivago was printed, he was tossed out of the Soviet Writers Union and was pretty much penniless. And
I'm talking about his younger years. He was probably 10
Oh.
or 15 or 20. at the
oh, he
time
was
you would-
studying. I'm sorry. He started as a concert. He was going to be a concert pianist. He studied music. Then he studied philosophy, went to study philosophy. Then from philosophy, he dropped out of that and decided he would become a poet. So he was doing a lot of education, a lot of schooling in his early years, in his first 20 years.
So who's able to avoid at least some of the difficulties of the time?
Yeah, well, they had money. He had money growing up. So he was okay. Like his family's father was a very wealthy portrait painter. His mother was a pianist and an artist. And so no, they were very well off, and he got to go do a lot of schooling all the way up through till he decided to become a poet.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, gang, where do you want to start?
Can I just say really quick?
You,
This
of,
is-
of course, Derek, because
I know. Well, I got to make
you're
up for
gonna
2
say
weeks.
anything you damn
Two-
well please. Go ahead.
I need to make up for 2 weeks worth.
I
But it's
understand.
two things, because Ginny, before we even started reading this book, Ginny said, well, we're not going to do 100 Years of Solitude because it's so annoying with the names and the repetitive names and this and that. And I got to tell you that this isn't too far off of that with all of this, with all of the Russian names, etc. But I did think it was funny or interesting in that as I was reading this, not that Pasternak does anything like this, but it would be so easy to have like the quick twist at the end of a novel with a Russian name because you could have the name going the whole way. And then at the very end, it'd be an entirely different name that people recognize the person for, but like a whole, I don't know, just to me, it seemed like a really like easy technique to do, to have like a super twist at the end, be it a name that you didn't know because they've been pronouncing it differently or it's spelled differently, etc. That's all.
You have a kind of diabolical sense, don't you? Yeah. Okay, so I gave you a bunch of questions. We don't have to start with them. We can start with anything you would like. Remember, this is yours. So, does anybody have something that came up in the reading that you were particularly curious about discussing, was surprising to you? You didn't quite up. It
Go to
seemed,
Lee.
seemed
not
like
really.
Lee is right there.
On page 204,
Okay.
this was when he gets back home,
Yeah.
and his old buddies come around, and he says right at the top, his friends had become strangely dull and colorless. None of them had held on to his own world, his own opinion. They were much brighter in his memories. Apparently, he had overestimated them earlier. And like it goes on about how, like, before all of this, when they were living well and living the good life, his friends seemed interesting and smart and clever. But now he's come back, and without all the, I guess, luxuries of their lives, he said that they're basically idiots, that don't have any thoughts or opinions of them for themselves. And I just thought that was so interesting, and like just the idea of like perspective on individuals in your life, like even like your parents when you're a kid, they're one way, and then as you become an adult, you experience them in a different way. I just thought that was such an interesting part to note.
That had
So, yeah, go ahead.
that had struck me too, but I've heard people returning from war have similar perspectives, because you're kind of like shoved into this environment that's so different from where you've grown in, and you've kind of seen things, I guess, for lack of a better word, that when you come back home, it's not like shell shock's not the right word, but this like weird reverse culture shock. And in my head, that's kind of like more than actually the time that he spent with her. I think that's the creation of this bond in his head with Laura, because he, you know, he's gone to war, he's experienced this stuff, he's come back home, he's a completely different person, because you can't go to war and not become a completely different person with what he's seen. But Laura's experienced this traumatic thing with him, and he comes back and like it's mundane, and like the things that he was worried about are so completely different. That struck me too, but I almost saw that more as a symptom of the war, and then also the start of that bond with Laura that has not so much to do with Laura herself, but then the shared environment and shared experiences that they had while working at the hospital.
So you
Really
don't
good.
think like that the circumstances that these people are in have exposed them? Like, I know I've met people, like I have one particular friend who's not really a friend anymore, but they would kind of like they didn't really have their own humor, but would like repeat what people around them were saying. And then when it would just be us, like the humor wasn't there, and you know, yeah,
Yeah,
just
I mean that could absolutely be a part of it, and that could also be exacerbated by something as traumatic as a war, which even makes it even more obvious when you come back that, oh well, they're just parroting what they're reading in the newspaper, or they're just kind of, you know, going in with the Bolsheviks or going in with the whites or whatever they happen to be doing at the time.
Yeah, it's interesting, Lee, because I had that same passage, because I love the line where he said how unregretfully they parted with independent thinking, which none of them evidently ever had, you know, and I'd marked that in mind because it's like they weren't really thinking anyway. But they also, of course, had been through a lot at home. You know, they weren't living in the same conditions they were living in when they left. And I think that's sort of the interesting contrast of the beginning where they're, you know, they're at the Christmas party and it's all, you know, lovely and people are dressed up and they, you know, they're in fairly wealthy situations. And then war comes, and not only, you know, has Yuri experienced, you know, a lot more death right up close and personal, but they've experienced a lot of privation, and a lot of what they, I think, found interesting in their lives was sort of making fun of the peasants or the lower class. And suddenly they were right in there with them. And now they had nobody to sort of ridicule. But I was fascinated by that same, you know, same section. Similar to, I think, to Pasha, who becomes disenchanted with his life with Laura. And he, you know, he does all this education and suddenly he's way smarter than everybody else. But he also seems not to be able to understand their relationship or how she sees her love for him, and just goes ahead and enlists in the army and says, I'm out of here. This will be easier to be in the army other than kill myself, which was his first thought, which was very strange for me as well.
I had underlined that exact line also, Jenny.
Yeah.
I think from what Lee said, I think that's very common when you leave home, whether it's something traumatic like war or untraumatic like college. I think you romanticize home, and whether it's your family or it's your high school friends, and you're so excited to come back and be with them, and you realize no one is the same. You're not the same. They're not the same. And I think because I think he perceives that he had a more traumatic experience, I think he is probably discounting some of the trauma that they have been through. As we know, it was traumatic just to try to continue your life. They lived in these grand houses. Now they have 2 rooms and all that kind of thing, and the firewood. And he hasn't been part of the struggle of daily life in Moscow. So he's probably considering that his experience was more traumatic than theirs, but it not necessarily was.
Yeah, and we're all talking about the personal relationships. I think too, the actual landscape itself can appear different. Everything around you can feel different, not just the people that you're dealing with. Like for instance, really quick, I grew up in Shelburne, Vermont. I was like, oh, we had this huge hill to sled down. Well, I went back to that hill a year ago and I was like, this is the worst hill of all time. But back then it was like the longest walk back up and blah, blah, blah. So I think it's also the environment and the scenery around too can dull in some cases like that.
And the environment intellectually. Were the people at home suppressed by what's happening in government and what can they say and how freely they can say it? Whereas in the war environment, they're probably much more open about their views and expressed it. So people may not be as responsive as they were originally.
That's good. Yeah. You know, and I think the other thing too is that, and I think some of you've already suggested this, but there's so much that's been plopped on the laps of, say, the residents of Moscow, who we see all the time here, where it's almost like they have so much going on just to survive. Okay, that is so different from the world before revolution occurred and World War I occurred, that it's almost like, you know, I had this great, I still have it, it's all chipped, but I have this great mug with a Gary Larson cartoon on it, and it says, Mrs. Smith, can I be excused from class? It's a little kid. My brain is full. And you know, I think there's something to be said about that. I think their brains were full. Their lives were full. There was, you know, and I think that's one of the ways, one of my questions talked about, you know, he doesn't go into like blow by blow violence, which he easily could have. But it's rather than we see this through the actions and the eyes of the people. We see the effect of the war. We see the effect of the violence. And to think that these folks could be the same as they were before, you know, he left for the war would be, you know, sort of unrealistic on his part. And it would be shocking as we would read it. It's like, well, of course they're going to get affected. I mean, they're in 3 little rooms. You know, they had a mansion.
Yeah, I
That in
think
it,
unrealistic. Oh, sorry.
yeah, go.
I was saying, I think unrealistic, but also understandable that he would like be yearning for like in his return home, like would want to go back to like, oh, I'm just excited to go back to my old friends and my old habits and my nice things. And so it's like, because also, you know, he was so distantly removed from it, it totally makes sense in the same way that, you know, Jennifer, you said like when you go home from college, you're like, you're wanting that like sense of familiarity. So it's like all the more disappointing when it's not, because it's like really a letdown from what I would imagine he would hope for.
Absolutely, absolutely.
It's one of the reasons why the divorce rate is so high with military members returning home, because when they've been gone, the spouses take care of everything, picking up duties generally that they've never even had, right? Paying the bills, fetching the firewood, whatever it may be. And then when they come back, you know, the person it's been gone to war, generally has been living on adrenaline for months, years, right?
Yeah,
And then when they come home, of course, they want everything to be just as they left it. They want everyone to be welcoming them with open arms. And they don't understand the difficulties as to what has happened at home and how hard it's been. So, you know, just, and that's why you do see a lot of families dissolve. But I wanted to touch on Yuri's relationship with Lara, in that I think that's when they truly fall in love, because he has such appreciation for her work ethic. They work so well together. They're so compatible. And yet they never have any kind of physical relationship. So to me, that's where the basis of all this really solidifies. And I don't think he can ever get her
out of his head from those times. In fact, he can't.
That's really good. That's really good. If you have the book at the bottom of 203, I think this kind of captures much of what we've been talking about at the beginning of the little section 4. In the course of the next few days, it became clear how alone he was. He did not blame anyone for that. Evidently, he himself had wanted it and achieved it. And then there's to me, a sort of connected quote on 205. And thus it turned out, about fifth of the way down, and thus it turned out that the only true life is one that resembles the life around us and drowns in it without leaving a trace. That isolated happiness is not happiness. So that a duck and alcohol, and that's the reference to that duck that he brings home, when they seem to be the only ones in town, are even not alcohol and a duck at all. That was the most distressing thing. What do you think about that? About both of those quotes? The effect of isolation, I think, on him, and the effect of isolation, generally speaking, on the populace. How is that, sort of, because they're all in it together, but the more that world presses on them, the more they become isolated.
It also seems it's very much every man for himself as the revolution you had to look out for yourself. They're all turning each other in. You kind of don't know your neighbors who you thought were your friends. You don't know where they're falling on this. You don't know who's putting pressure on this. And it's interesting. The revolution was supposed to unite them. And instead it was incredibly divisive as a way of self-preservation.
Yeah, good.
And I think too, the duck and the alcohol, they thought would bring them like happiness, like we're gonna have this big meal, we haven't had any food, the luxury of a duck, but they couldn't enjoy it. He couldn't enjoy it because he knew so many people were without, and that it wasn't any longer something that he could be happy about because he realized other people didn't have it. Whereas before, when they were eating well and everything was great, it was okay because he didn't have any idea what privation was going on. But now that he did, and his eyes were open to that, he couldn't appreciate having the alcohol and the duck, even for that small moment that they could have just been like, let's just let go of this and enjoy the fact that we have food and drink. He couldn't do that. And I love the fact that somewhere at the point he said too, it was impossible to enjoy the duck because there was no bread with it. If we didn't have bread to have with the duck, you might as well not even have duck if you can't have the bread with it. That it was such a change that couldn't bring him joy. And I think the other piece too was his son, Sashenka, not knowing him, which I imagine in the military as well, is when you're away for a long time and your children don't even know you, and had like didn't want to be with him. I mean, how disorienting that would be. So you feel like he really just said his wife and his father-in-law, they're the only two people that he felt like he was connecting with. And that was it. And his work.
It has shades of Castaway for me. Castaway, even though the opposite, right? Tom Hanks comes home, they throw him this giant party, and meanwhile he's been fighting for, tooth and nail to get something to eat, and there's all this crab leg on the table, crab legs. When he gets back to the party, it's like, he feels disconnected, he's been gone, and he can't relate to anything that's there in front of him, even though it was there and great. Well connected before he went away.
But also something interesting. I mean, there was poverty before this too.
But he wasn't part of it.
Didn't affect them. I mean, I think there's something to that too, when the mighty fall and the things they ignored, suddenly it's, do you know how horrible this is to be hungry, to not be able to get firewood? So, which is also kind of part of a workers' revolution and socialism and all of that.
I've been I tutor in literacy programs, and one fellow who I'm working with, Christian, he's a guy who started with me with a fifth grade reading level, He's 33 years old. He can't get any kind of advancement because of his reading skills and whatever kind of job he has. But he's really interesting and interested. He's particularly interested in the Romanovs and the Russian Revolution, that and Queen Victoria. So I bought him this book. It's sort of like I guess you'd call it, it's really good though. It's a young adult book on the Romanov family by a woman named Candace Fleming, who was an excellent writer. But as we were, so we read it together when we meet each week. And one thing that he understands as we're reading about the Romanov family and their, in their unbelievable palaces, he understands, and he will ask the question, but what about the other people? What about the peasants? And in the book, I mean, it's beautifully illustrated. There are photographs of the peasants, and Kendall showed us some of those photos last week. The barefoot kids, the sort of grim living situations. And I found it. I mean, I don't give him table slaps, but I would have given him a table slap when he, was pointing out, well, where is the understanding? Where is the understanding of the poverty? Where's the understanding of all of the rural poverty as well as the urban poverty in Russia? And I said, well, and then he continued to say, yeah. So I guess they kind of needed that revolution, huh? And I said, yeah, well, you kind of have it there. You kind of have it there. You see one of the reasons for it. And I'm just going to sort of in a I don't know how the way my brain works anyway, and it's more troublesome as I age. But anyway, on page 232 at the bottom, I think there's a relationship between what we've been talking about and this quote. On his return, bottom of the page, on his return, Yuri Andreevich did not discuss his wife's purchase. Remember what the purchase was?
The firewood.
Birchwood.
Yeah,
The
it was
crappy
birchwood
firewood.
for
Crappy
Stuff
birchwood.
that didn't burn, right?
right, for
An armoire.
beautiful armoire.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So he did not discuss his wife's purchase. And it's interesting to me the word, well, let me read the damn quote, then we can get back to what's interesting to me. Okay. To chop the given away wardrobe to splinters would have been more profitable and expedient, but they could not have brought themselves to do it. What is that saying? Oh, the word that I was particularly interested in was purchase.
Well, that's a conflict of the value or the belief in the furniture and its meaning as opposed to the functionality of the wood. So
Yeah, and so what does that furniture mean?
They couldn't let go of those
They
trappings.
couldn't sever ties to their old life, old
Yeah.
world.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
that they had so much reverence for these representations of wealth and class that they couldn't bring themselves to have used it for something as banal as firewood.
but could still get rid of it and trade it in effect for scrap wood.
And also potatoes in the future. They were getting, he was taking it as a present to his wife, and they hoped to get some potatoes out of it as well as the, firewood. But I do think it's hard to have something you value and then say, yeah, I'm just going to smash it. They haven't gotten quite that desperate yet that they were, they went ahead and sold it rather than broke it up themselves. I think it's hard to let go of things.
Purchase, like that makes me like I love going shopping. Um, so it's like, oh, she went out and purchased something. She like got to go shopping. And then like for me, I also love beautiful things like furniture and things that have, I think they know I have a daughter. They've seen you.
Hi. Hey there.
Hello.
That's
Hello.
Clara.
Hi, Clara.
Hi, Clara.
Um, so like I feel like I would want to do the same thing. Like, oh, like maybe this will survive like until after this is all over, and you know, there will still be beautiful things out there that were here before all of this mayhem.
Like a way of
Yeah.
preserving their culture. Right?
What is the guy on what's the guy who got the armoire going to do with it?
He said he was giving as a present to his young wife.
Okay. Okay. So he was kind of continuing, right? The
Wasn't she sick?
tradition.
Wasn't she sick
Yeah.
with typhus?
Yes.
And that was one subject that I think we should be tracking, typhus. So I did look it up, and it's basically a flea-borne disease from rats and vermin. We don't really hear too much about it today, but clearly, and then so many times you're hearing about the rats invading and the mice are everywhere, and hence the typhus.
Yeah. But I mean, we may be hearing more about it, with the current administration, but we're not going there for a moment. So what? Why don't you go with that? Run with it a little while, Karen. You see it a lot, and why has it become sort of, yeah? I mean, it's a major issue.
So, I mean, when you read this, you can't help but put yourself in these conditions.
Mhm.
So, the complete lack of sanitation, they're practically starving. So, and if they're eating potatoes, which, although of some nutritional value, they're lacking protein. Vegetables are relatively scarce, and they're freezing. They're freezing. So, all of these, even those that own property, maybe small farms, they had the ability to somewhat, they were used to sustaining themselves, correct?
Mhm.
But not the Muscovites. The Muscovites were city dwellers. They purchased everything. Well, now they have nothing, right? Whatever little they have to barter is slowly dwindling, and I think it's just that typhus is just an example of the complete deterioration of the human condition. I mean,
And it's all not something that's necessarily only affecting the poor.
correct. Well, because everyone's stature, I mean, other than Komorowski, like almost everybody else is impoverished. They've all descended so dramatically in their lifestyles.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think you think about typhus and dysentery as being like the two things, dysentery is very waterborne, polluted water. And then the typhus, they're both highly contagious and they just spread just when Yuri goes to treat the woman, with typhus and then he gets it and collapses from it. It's very difficult, as you say, when you're in a situation where you're already run down, you're not at the best physical strength and you're being exposed to all these things that are out there as a result of the fact that there's nobody doing anything. Their whole civilization has fallen apart. I mean, even if you thought the Romanovs knew the Romanovs were trouble, there was some structure to society, and now there's no structure because suddenly they've gone from World War I into a revolution and nobody's paying any attention. I mean, I love when they have these collective meetings and, let's form a committee, like everything's, let's have a committee and talk about this, and who's on your committee and sign up. But people are starving and people are dying. And, short of Yuri and all the doctors, I believe, as you go on too, leave the hospital because it's just too much trouble, and they're not making any money. So Yuri's the only one who stays and he's looked down on for staying there and working. There isn't anybody taking care of the everyday parts of life that need to be taken care of. And that's what's really broken down in this
Yeah.
whole revolution, and it's affecting them as individuals in their relationships, but it's more affecting them physically. I mean, to make it through a Russian winter without enough fuel, lots of people are going to die. It's like the siege of Leningrad, why, millions died. Because
I mean, it seems to be hell on earth.
Mhm.
And I can tell you right now, I would not have lived through it. So I'm just putting it.
I'd be right there with you. I would not have made it 5 feet in
Just
this.
die early because
Yeah, I might as well just go in the initial thing, because this whole like starving and eating and watching your children die in front of you because you can't get food or warmth for them. They get sick and there's nobody to treat them. It's amazing. I mean, and when you think about in World War II, of the millions of Russians that died, I mean, no wonder they have a completely different outlook on life than Americans do. Because although we've gone through periods of deprivation, nothing like this, day in and day out for, years on end.
You're also stressed by what used to be your friends and housemates. When the committee forms and votes you out of the building, the building's gonna be
Gotta
taken over
go.
by other people. So you have to find another place to live, and you've got no people support and no place to live.
So here's a question that's kind of well, it's kind of obvious, but it just popped into my head and in a sort of a different form. So we've read 2 sections of the book. Okay, what do we find that's absent in this section that was present in the first section that might relate to the subjects that we're talking about tonight? Like what elements, in society, in the sort of human consciousness or whatever, seem to be absent here.
Not seeing any hope.
Uh-huh.
You don't
Okay.
Well,
see a
I mean,
future.
there wasn't World War I and the revolution in the first part, so they were,
Okay.
they had a train strike or things like that going on, but there wasn't a major world upheaval like World War I, followed by, a revolution in your own country where turning. So that was missing. So they had hope and they had plans. People, I think, made plans like, Tanya's going to be a lawyer and, Pasha's going to do this and be a teacher. And then, everybody's plans change. Even Laura, who was happy and happiest she'd ever been with Pasha and Katenka, when Pasha goes away, says, well, I'm going to be a nurse now and go see if I can find him, out there on the front somewhere and look for him.
Yeah, that's good.
I
Anything
also
else?
think like a lot fewer people, which like made it easier as a reader, honestly, like to not have to keep track of all the characters, but like the world definitely like narrowed in, which I think
Yeah, excellent.
like parallels his feelings of isolation. But it's like we were really only focused on like 1 or 2 storylines, where in the first like however many chapters it was like 30 different storylines. So that was, I think, a stark contrast for me.
That's really good. Okay, yeah, and it fits perfectly with what we were saying, how the world becomes smaller during these times of sort of desperation, revolution, whatever. Is there anything else that you? I mean, I'll tell you. It's like a.
What about religion?
Okay, that's it. Yeah, that was what I would. That's what went into my brain. Okay, let's talk about it.
So on page 143 at the bottom, it was interesting when they were talking there about what is a people. And it started the bottom of that where it says, when it said that in the kingdom of God, there are no Greeks and Jews, did it merely mean to say that everyone is equal before God? No, there was no need for that then. The Greek philosophers, the Roman moralists, the prophets of the Old Testament knew that before. But it said in that new way of existence, a new form of communion conceived in the heart and known as the kingdom of God, there are no peoples, there are persons. And so they're framing their discussion on religious basis. And then that suddenly shifts in the next part to we're all workers, working man's world. So we're comrade now, not persons, but we are comrade this, comrade that. And we've taken away the religious aspect of what they were talking about in the beginning. Because it was sort of interesting that they were talking about that there shouldn't, as Kendall mentioned last week, whether there are 200 different nationalities in Russia, so there were all these different people, but they're saying they're not people, they're persons. And then they become comrades and we're all going to be the same. And suddenly religion as a driving force in their life, because there are a lot of Christians and the, Roman, Russian Catholic Church, now that's out the window as well. And I think it's affects how they frame, how they look at life. Not for everybody, because some people obviously are still devout, but a lot of people lose their faith in.
But we really don't see that, right? We don't see the devout Christians here in this section, right? In the second section, they play a very, very small role comparative to the rest. And
Right.
I suppose that's from an authorial standpoint, well, that makes sense. He can't. It's a long enough novel as it is, with seemingly in Tessa's mind, thousands of characters. But
There are thousands, and they each have 10 names.
right, okay, there we. I mean, it's just. I know that, but it's not. This is the way the Russians were. I mean, this is their name, their name system. But anyway, yeah, I think the religion. It's after I read it, I was saying, yeah, it's and is it is it really, well? Hey, we've got to worry about finding some food. We've got to worry about finding some birch sticks. But I guess what was interesting to me is that in times of crisis and desperation, there is often a turn towards religion. And I wonder how, what you think about how that seems absent here. Now, given, the quote that Ginny just gave us, well, it's a different kind of religion, I suppose, right? That they're espousing there, right? And it is a kind of religion of those who've been trampled upon, right? It references, to the Jews particularly. But that was a really long question. So, yeah, I mean, it puzzles. I mean, it I don't have an answer to this, but it puzzles me that there is so little. I get it to a certain extent, but that there is so little reference to people in Russia who, I mean, there is no evidence that they were not religious, that they were not committed religious people, but that there seems to be no hope through religion. You know what I'm saying? And how does that affect the way we see that society as it, I mean, it's a developing society through all of the violence, through all the war, through the revolution.
Could that be a function of like when the book was written itself, like when it was the state-sponsored atheism required by the Soviet system? Because he was kind of like, when they're describing Zhivago, he's insufficiently red for the reds and insufficiently white for the whites, and he's kind of skirting these lines, which to me almost, if you are Pasternak trying to write this book under the Soviet eye, well, not necessarily trying to outwardly intentionally antagonize people, like if you have religion playing that sizable a role during a time when atheism is mandated, would that just be a bridge too far?
That's a great question, because I mean, after all, the book was banned. So, is it, is it an attempt by Pasternak to avoid a subject that obviously would raise the hackles of, the regime, in which he was writing, during which he was writing the book, right? But that's really interesting, because to me, then it also asks the question, so why was it banned? What are you seeing that say, I got it, I see why this book was banned by the communist regime?
because it's not propaganda. Because he is sitting on the fence, right? Like it's not glory to the workers, and it's not about the success and the glory of Soviet socialism. It's kind of too real for that, I guess. And it's certainly not overly sympathetic to the whites either, but it's just not culturally in line with, I think, the messaging that was mandated at the time through the cultural, the powers that be.
You bring up another. Well, somebody wanted to speak. I'll shut up.
All right, just really quickly. I was gonna say there's also just a lot of talk about like the power of the individual, and like in the beginning, Nikolai Nikolaevich, I think, he has all this talk about how like, forget exactly what it is, but like the only way to really achieve intellectual status is to be an individual, and like there's this attraction towards the group, but like they'll never be as smart. Essentially, like I'm not saying it right very well, but I
No,
think that would go against a lot of like the typical communist ideals.
I think,
Okay. Yeah.
right, the very point that Lee brought up from the very beginning, when he said his friends didn't have any more independent thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
And being a Soviet is not about independent thought, it's about the group. And so
Right.
Pasternak's very much about independence of thought. And also they had a very pretty strict morality sort of thing, and the idea of, an affair going on, not being true to your wife, even though, I'm sure many communists had affairs or whatever, but it's sort of what they put up as propaganda was that it was not socially appropriate as well, what was going on in the book. But I think his whole championing of independent thought and being your own person is not setting up to be a good communist.
Which also brings up a big theme in the book, which is fate versus free will. I mean, how much of what happens to our characters are of their own agency? We're all very much tied into the time and history in which we live. And they are living in an incredibly turbulent time in history where they have very little free will. So, I mean, another part of the book.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is, now we're going to sort of turn it around. So you would think that the more he would attack the czarist regime, he would gain some points with the communists, with the Soviets. All right. So where do you see attacks of and we're talking like relatively speaking here. We've read this chunk, which is a heavy. You just have to be patient. You have to be patient. But relatively speaking, it seems to me that there's not much addressing the czars, the governments, the governmental regime at the time, which was still in power. Yeah, I think it was. Yeah, through our reading, right? Essentially, I mean, the czar had agreed to the establishment of the Duma. I think it was in 1915, right? Which meant that it was that, and I will call upon Kendall's students to give the buzzwords of what that particular regime would have been called, with monarchy at the beginning. Didn't he?
But it was also a weird time because was it between 1905 and 1915 was like the provisional government? So
yes.
It's not like it was the straight up czarist.
Yes.
So attacking the czarist regime kind of would be out of chronology, because the czar had already abdicated a lot of their power after the 1905 revolution.
Yes.
So it's things are already within a lot of upheaval, and there really isn't a strong government anyway, because it's like half czar, it's like half pregnant almost. It's like half czar but not quite. So kind of attacking, it doesn't make sense to attack something that's already kind of decrepit, because it's taken itself out in a sense.
And we're
Put
not
it
finished the book yet either. I mean, so,
Yeah.
you know, it's the
Right,
totality
right.
of the book that they're going to be unhappy with as it goes on. I mean, communism is just getting, but he's not portraying communism, the workers' revolution, as something that's been great for everybody because they're starving and they have no food and they have no heat and there's no real organized, you know, the committees aren't doing much of anything. So it's not making it look like the communists taking over is in this section the best thing that's ever happened to them.
And the mother is like disowning her son, who's a war hero, just
Yeah.
because he's gone for the bad, and
Don't talk about him.
I'm taking that to assume he's gone in with the whites is my best
Mhm.
assumption, but like that's all it takes, kind of, to
Yes.
he's gone in with the bad.
Yeah. And you know, there are the occasional reference to the Cossacks.
Mhm.
Okay, and the Cossacks were obviously the czars. Those were and there is that moment of cruelty when they shoot the elderly soldier as the army is on retreat. But I think you made a good point. Is that at this particular time, and it made it timely for the revolution, there was already a deterioration of the power of the czar and the power of what the czar represented. Yeah, yeah.
On page 213,
Yes.
um, he's I don't know, I forget what he's like. I think this is when they're in one of those committee meetings. But he says, but everything truly great is without beginning, like the universe. It does not emerge, but is suddenly there, as if it always existed or fell from the sky. I also think that Russia is destined to become the first realm of socialism since the existence of the world. When that happens, it will stun us for a long time. And coming to our senses, we will no longer get back the memory we have lost. We will forget part of the past and will not seek explanations for the unprecedented. The new order will stand around us with the accustomedness of the forest on the horizon or the clouds over our heads. It will surround us everywhere. There will be nothing else. So yeah, that doesn't seem very like, yeah, it's gonna be great. Like we will just be so stunned, post-traumatic stress disorder. We will just be existing and it will just be what it is.
Yeah, yeah.
We won't want to know
Frank,
explanations.
the one who says that?
Pretty sure it's Zhivago, isn't it?
Because the next line is he said something more, and by then it sobered up completely.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it
I
was.
think. Pretty
Okay,
sure.
oh, is it Goguchka?
I don't know, but I just thought that was an interesting. I don't pay attention to the names. Literally, when a name comes up, I read over it. So I don't know who's saying what.
No, that whole thing is Zhivago
Yep.
Wait a minute. Okay.
because he stands up at the table and he
Yeah.
starts with him standing up at the table and making this whole speech.
Yes. Yeah.
In general, throughout the book, it doesn't go through the he said, she said. It is to have the conversation. You have to sometimes figure out who's saying it.
You're right. Yeah. You know, he's a crafty one, that Pasternak, and you know, making us work so damn hard. Right. Um, okay. So we've sort of, this has been great. I mean, I've loved this. So I'm looking at these questions to see if there's some.
While you're looking, I want to ask you because I had never heard of pathetic fallacy, so I was busy looking that up. And on page 150, I want to see if I found one that's actually
Okay.
one on page 150 in the second paragraph. It says, outside the window, the sleepily breathing wind kept yawning and tossing. The wind wept and prattled. Is that what you're talking about?
You got it.
Because I was like, I had to read up on that. I was definitely not somebody, I'd never heard that expression before.
What about the clocks? The two clocks that had meaning and chimed when things were happening. I think that's represents it as well.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, you know, the idea is that it's sort of when either I mean, the pathetic fallacy is, that refers specifically to nature. But I think whenever there is like the intrusion of a symbolic world, like, these clocks, you know, you nailed it. I mean, why the clocks? Why are the clocks there? You know, um, there's a kind of emotional element
I
to.
think the river's an example, yes.
Well, speak on, Derek.
Well, I mean, sometimes a river can be cool and calm and peaceful, and other times it can be raging and turbulent and out of control. And I think that that happens several times throughout the book, and he seems to mention it.
And they're moments of beauty, where nature sort of
Serenity and calm.
and it
Yes.
stills the narrative, right?
He has some beautiful passages where he talks about just how lovely everything is, in between all the horrible stuff when he's describing stuff. There are some lovely descriptions in the book, in that section we just read.
Yeah. And when our emotions get affected by that, then it's kind of pathetic fallacy, right? I mean, the pathos.
Right.
It's drawing our pathos. If we change emotionally as we're reading, then then we've seen the pathetic fallacy at work. I mean, another thing you see is that, and you can think about throughout, in future readings too, is the idea of the journey towards, the journey back. Think about how much people are traveling, right? And think about where they're starting and where they're coming from. I mean, the most obvious we've talked a lot about today is Yuri. So he travels back. It's not like some speed train getting him there, but he travels back to Moscow from the front. So the travel is more than a trip. It's a psychological journey that he's taken. Okay. And the same thing happens when we travel east, right? Which will happen more and more, but we already have traveled east in the book, okay? And, what is east associated with?
Well, the Urals, he goes to the Urals, right? It's the gateway to Asia.
Okay, it's the gateway to Asia. Good. You're going east to the Urals. Okay.
Sunrise.
Was that what?
Sunrise.
Okay. Sunrise, enlightenment, and so forth. And, think about it. That journey, or the journeys that we will see, partly are out of, necessity. Okay, we got to get the hell out of Moscow, right? But part of them also, sort of symbolically represent, okay, this escape is necessary. What are we escaping to? We're escaping to the east. We're escaping to the mountains. We're escaping to a more verdant landscape. We're escaping to safety, in a way, right? I mean, so keep in mind all of these kind of movements, whether we're, various ways that characters travel, right?
I also thought it was interesting too how Dickens, like a lot of this was, where people were coming together in places that you've forgotten about, like when they have the scene in the hospital where Laura, Yuri, Gallatin, Gallatin's father, like they're all in the same place at the same time suddenly, and they don't even necessarily recognize each other. And then all the talk about the guy who was the mute that they thought was a legend, and he ends up being his partner in the train with him, and he doesn't even realize that, he's like, well, he just doesn't talk after dark, that he was reading his throat in order to have the conversation with him, which I thought was fascinating, that entire thing. But how he was sort of a legend, and then there he was. Like, people seem to appear and disappear into people's lives, like Dickens brings them in and out, like characters you sort of heard about, and then suddenly they're back again, or they, reappear. That he has a lot of that going on. There were several segments where people just suddenly appeared that you'd met in the first section, but you hadn't heard about for a while, and then there they are.
Pasternak I think next week I'll in within the questions I'll give you a few quotes of that trash the novel from critics, and one of the complaints is that there are just too many. The coincidences make it ridiculous. So, do you believe that? Does life have no coincidences? I remember when I first read the book, it seemed like, well, yeah, okay, so Lara shows up at at this hospital. She becomes a nurse. Zhivago's already a doctor. So why is this just so wildly coincidental? Why is Pasternak tricking us?
I thought it was on purpose to show how interconnected the Russian people were, that they really did need each other. And
Wow.
they,
Wow.
even if they thought with the classes that they were above someone or whatever, that they all keep intersecting. And I don't know, we had talked a lot in the last one about, we were all so confused with these millions of characters, and so much of it seems so superfluous and heavy and hard to get through for all of us with these names and everything. But I think what he was doing was trying to show that that's a society, that a society is more than the people that you purposely interact with, that there's all these layers, and that's what made up the Russian people. And some of these people that you dismissed or didn't recognize or notice might really become important later.
There's a little, it felt contrived to me, but almost a necessity of the story. Just because it is an epic, sweeping story that there's bounds. I mean, Moscow, when I was living there, it was like 13 million people lived in that city. Like, it's a big ass city. And I mean, granted, it was a lot smaller back then, but still, it is one of the biggest, or was one of the biggest urban centers in the world at that point. So I mean, it's still a little contrived, but I mean, it's a story, it's fiction. That's kind of, to me, it's just something that you chalk up to. That's like a license that the author takes in order to give you these rich characters that then interact with each other in interesting ways. I don't know.
I also think in real life it happens, though. I mean, how many times have you been somewhere and you run into people that you hadn't seen forever, and you're both in the random same place at the same time, and you're like, what are you doing here? I mean, one time I was traveling with a lacrosse team and we ran into Richard House at a rest stop on the turnpike, and like all the kids went running up to Richard House, like, Mr. House, and here's this guy having lunch at a turnpike rest stop. Now you would say that's contrived, but that happened, and that was just so random. But it happens in real life sometimes. You just run into people, and I would think in war, where people are, as you said, people are moving a lot to and to the city, from the city, and being forced to interact more, particularly in the second part, because of food and fuel. I can't just live in my house and eat and say, hey, servants, bring me things. I only interact with my friends. I got to get out there in the street and look for stuff. Of course, Yuri's out there, treating people. So already he's touching a lot of lives just through medicine. But it is, I don't think it seems as contrived as you think, because of the fact that it happens more often in real life than you think.
Goes back to the expression, it's a small world, and it's the circles we work in. So it's the medical circle, it's the educational circle. As I mentioned, the looking for food or looking for fuel, the places where it would be likely for these people to meet and come together. So it's a little strange, but not so strange.
Right.
Yeah.
I do have it is 8:50, just so if people are.
I just love to wonder, like, if authors what are they intending, and what are, it's like art too, like a painting, like we're making such a big deal about these things, but like, was it,
Right. What would Pasternak say if we could ask him?
Yeah.
Exactly.
There's a theory of literary criticism, and some of you, I think I probably mentioned it to my students, reader response. So the idea of the reader response is, first of all, each one of us right now is reading a different novel. Okay. Our understanding of this novel is based on our age, our education, our ethnic backgrounds. So everyone is reading. I mean, we can agree on certain issues, you know, what actually happens in the book and what a particular quote says, but how we're absorbing that is very different. Can be very, very different. I mean, I come from Polish and Ukrainian roots. So my reading of this, I mean, I can't like define. So how is this different, Peter? Well, I don't know, but I know damn well that when I see, you know, anything smacking of Russian authoritarianism or potential authoritarianism in the novel, right? That's, that immediately places me today. I mean, my dad's family was, it was part of Poland then, but it was in Lviv, LVIV or LVOV, and in the now it's in Ukraine, right? But anyway, I'm not. What I'm trying to get at is that you know how whether we view something as coincidence also depends on how coincidences work in our lives. Have there been significant, and I'm not going to bother you with this now, but if you want to, someday I will regale you with the narrative of how the love of my life and I rejoined through total coincidental
And that
accident
was a random circumstance, which I know the story.
after
So, but if you wrote that as a story, you'd say that's so contrived, but
no,
it
people
happened.
say, yeah, this couldn't, yeah. But
Well, it's
anyway,
funny
we
that
had,
you say coincidence instead of like fate or kismet in the story, because just to your point, Doc, you could be reading the story totally oblivious to the Russian Revolution
yes,
and look at it strictly as a love story and be like moving along just like it's a normal story, but it's just a love story. Everybody's so smart on this group, and we break it down and we can look at it historically, with the factual stuff, but you could just be reading it like a straight up love story, potentially.
yeah, yeah. And to very, very briefly tell you, since Ginny brought this up or furthered my, after I used to be a, anti-Vietnam War protester. I worked for Eugene McCarthy